Diana, Faye,
They
and
can't see it if you put it down here.
Okay, we need we need to start because we need to stop at 5 to 11.
no. Oh, I'm barely gonna make it. Okay, I'll do my best. What's happening? All right, okay, I'll do my best. I'll do my best. We have a lot of evil things to cover. Okay, all right. I wanted to. All right, I'm starting. I did want, notwithstanding the time pressure, I did want to just, because I got a lot of questions after Rena's testimony, and I just wanted to fill in a few factual pieces for those who were curious. The fact that she was a very little girl, just I'm giving you the very highlights. She was a very little girl and she was at home with her family. At a certain point, her father was taken away to work in this factory, and she was with her brothers and her mother at home. And it was at that point when her father was at the factory that they were taken to the shul. From the shul, there was this back door. There was a main shul and there's a Beit Midrash, and you can go visit it actually. And it's now a library. And if you move the curtain in the Beit Midrash, you can see where the Aron Kodesh is riddled with bullets. In any case, she was there and she doesn't have clear memories, but the door opened and some man who she suspects was some kind of uncle or something motioned her for her to come out, and her mother pushed her, and this man brought her to her father in the factory, and she stayed with him posing as a little boy Ephraim for quite a bit of time. She had to speak as a little boy and live as a little boy, and she used to bring water to them in the factory. And then it was from that factory they were taken to yet another camp, and when they were on the train, it became clear that in the next camp they were going to be separated, men and women, and that she would have to go to and that's when he handed her off, her father handed her off to this other woman, and that's where she then went to several other women. She was passed from woman to woman, and at the end of the war, she was brought as an orphan to Sweden. That's where there was a Christian family that wanted to adopt her, that she very much wanted to be. I'm sorry? They were visiting her in the hospital and they wanted to adopt her, and she very much wanted to be adopted by them. But other adults who were Jewish said no, she had to go to other Jews. And while she was waiting for safe passage to Palestine, that's when this other woman who had relatives in the States gave her own daughter, passed away. And then Rena became this woman's daughter. She came to America with this woman and her son as this daughter, became this other person then. And then when during the summer, the mother died, this new mother then died. And then at that point, this relative who had brought in his sister and nephew didn't have any real connection to take care of this little girl. And then she was once again on the hunt for a family. And that's when she was adopted by the people she calls her parents, who were in Brooklyn. So that's just the basic outline. Okay, stepping back to where we left off. One moment. Not yet, but thank you. Yeah, but I'm gonna have to pair it or something.
It's not on your phone, right?
No, I turned off my phone. I learned a little bit. One second. No, I'm gonna have to. What do I need now? That's good. Can you hook me up? All right. I'm gonna, in the meantime, Bluetooth. Okay, good.
Your phone.
I turned off my phone. I only make the same mistake a few times, not forever. What? Okay, I'll make it through today now. How come it's not connecting? Oh, here, connect. Okay, Tove, take that there.
70%.
I don't know.
Shifi, did she say how old she was? Because she was about to and I had missed it.
He was very little when it all started, I think about 3.
Okay.
Okay, let me get into the content for today. When I last left you, we were discussing this issue of how was it humanly possible. We've discussed bystanders and we shifted from bystanders into a discussion of the perpetrators themselves. And we posed the question, how was it humanly possible? And Rav Lau and Professor Shwed both answered, why are that simply posing the question betrays a certain element of naivete, because it's intrinsic to the way a human being was created in Breshit, as it was recounted, that we have both evil and good impulses. And so therefore it's highly possible that that cute little bouncing baby, which was ultimately turned out to be Hitler, that he could have started as a wonderful looking little boy, as a baby once upon a time. So they both of those thinkers, Rav Lau and Professor Shwed, say the question really doesn't even need to be asked, because from time immemorial, this has been the story of the world, that we have bechira chofshit, that we have a choice how to behave, and that's built into our being. But the truth is that what led us to this question of how it was humanly possible was the letter which we posed, which was written by Rudolf Hess, who's the commandant of Auschwitz, and where he's writing to his children this very warm letter about, a mother's love. And at the same time, we know that the reason why he's dying, why he's going to be hung the next morning, is because he killed more than a million people. And so that's really the essence of our question. Not so much how is it that people can become horrible murderers, but rather how do they exist within this duality? How is it that people can look so normative, can have this sort of coexistence between a normal face and at the same time to commit these horrible atrocities? And so what I'd like to do with today is to run through here, and I've kind of summarized them, different methods, and I'm gonna go through each of these in more depth, but different methods or different phenomenon. How is it that people can allow themselves to psychologically unburden themselves? In other words, how is it that people can exist in this world in a normative sort of life and have a parallel track of violence, of horrible things? So the first one, which we're going to again address in a little bit more detail, is this idea of propaganda, that when someone has been subjected to a re-education of sorts to view someone as horrible, then that allows them to commit these terrible acts, and that eases the way. Another thing which people do to as a strategy to allow themselves to exist in normal life and do terrible things is that they put blinders on. In other words, they minimize their own role, and they also drain the human element out of whatever it is that they're doing. They write it up like the way you would write up a laundry list, the way you would write up a shopping list. They drain all of the human pathos out of whatever it is that they're doing. A third method that people do is that they create this sort of emotional disassociation. It's a split personality. They recognize what it is wrong, but they kind of lock it up in a compartment somewhere and they don't touch it and they leave it on the side. Another method is that they see that it's terrible, but they disclaim responsibility. They don't feel they were following orders. Either it's their superior's fault, or it's God's fault, or it's some government's fault, but they themselves recognize that it's something wrong, but they don't feel personally responsible. Another method, number 5, is that they don't, what they're doing, they say, well, it might be a value not to kill, but this is subsumed, this is under, I've got a higher value, which I'm serving. So that it's not that this killing is an aberration, in other words, that I'm violating certain values or morals, but I've got a higher calling, which allows me to do whatever it is that I'm doing. And so they kind of excuse themselves from anything that they're doing wrong. Then 6 would be an idea of groupthink, sort of social psychology. There are those that have posited that what allowed everything to happen is that everybody was doing it. So people just got swept along. And then number 7, which we're going to come to at the end, 11 o'clock or not, we're going to come to the end, is pure base anti-Semitism, that they hated the Jews. And so that's what allowed them to do what they intended to do. All right, so now I'm going to go through and each of these to some degree of depth. A great many of scholars have analyzed the issue of propaganda, specifically vis-a-vis Germany. Because if you think about it, the Nazis came to power in 1933, and there were small things that were being done. I mean, they're small. It's easy for me to say small. If you're living in Germany, it didn't feel so small. But there were various actions which were gradually in increasing severity and violence being inflicted on the Jewish community in Germany. But really, there was a pretty long runway till the outbreak of the war in 1939. I'll just quote in a few of these from these scholars. I'll read the first one. It says, excluding people from the community, defining them as outsiders profoundly changes the daily relationships between individuals and groups. And I'll remind you from the history lesson that we ran through, in Germany and in Germany in particular, but in many of the Western European countries, the Jewish community was incredibly intertwined and part of general life. This is to be distinguished from where you go further east, where no Jew really called themselves a Pole. It's kind of funny because, you know, it's very rare to say Jewish Pole. You were either a Jew or you were a Pole. Whereas in Germany, you could be a German Jew, you could be a German Christian. In any case, so defining these German Jews as outsiders was a prerequisite. It was the first step in the violence. It says, consciously or unconsciously, the insiders reshape their own identities in ways that justify the exclusion of others. The victims are not only blamed for their weakness, those who have benefited from their tragedy convince themselves that it was morally justified. I'll continue on with another quote where it says, even if we never know exactly how and to what extent all of this sensory input in the initial years of the Nazi regime shaped the attitudes and behaviors of those who implemented the final solution, they must have had a considerably lasting influence on the participants and bystanders. There can also be no doubt Jew hatred transformed Jews into a target for annihilation, into a group of socially dead, well before the German Judenpolitik reached the stage of mass murder. So all of these preparatory steps, and we've discussed earlier the whole idea of functionalism and intentionalism, how much of this was being done consciously as a preparatory state and how much it just kind of the ultimate annihilation kind of evolved on the ground. But even if you take the position that the ultimate murder was not defined and set out in 1933, that this is something which evolved, there's no question that all of this propaganda and all of the ways in which the Jews were being pulled out of the general stream of life and not allowed to practice their professions and being forced ultimately to live in certain Jewish buildings, all of that had a preparatory effect so that it eased the way for murder. So that would be the first, this idea of propaganda as being a method, a factor, which allowed German civilians who before the war lived normative lives and after the war lived normative lives, allowed them to psychologically handle the fact that during the war, they were committing murder against the Jews. The next one in that list of methods which I described was this idea of putting on blinders. And this became clear in trials after the war. You know, they went, very rarely did they go after the little people, but every so often there were investigations and there were tribunals and there were some trials of different people who, for instance, worked in the railway system. And so these people, you know, were part and parcel of that big machinery, which was murdering the Jews. What did they say in their defense? So there was a trial held in Düsseldorf in 1964. And here's an example. There's somebody who was a Walter Steyer, who was an official planning the timetable in the railway. He says, I dealt with these matters only from my desk. My sole activity was technically taking care of train timetables. Another one says, I made appropriate reports on the corpses found on the tracks in my jurisdiction. The reports were submitted to the management. By this, I had fulfilled my duty. In other words, each one is kind of putting themselves in a little box, and notwithstanding the fact that it would be almost impossible not to see the greater picture, they're certainly, at least after the fact, saying, oh, no, I only had my little piece. Another person said, I heard the shooting along the train, but I never saw them. I never turned my head and looked back. I always looked forward, literally putting on blinders and just moving forward. And last, I did not see anything of the loading of the Jews at the Bialystok railway station. I was totally immersed in filling out the many documents for transport, and I had no time to observe what was going on around me. Okay, so these are the ways in which, at least after the fact, at least when people are holding them accountable, the ways in which people defend themselves. I didn't know anything, see no evil, hear no evil, that sort of idea. But this sort of draining of human content, these blinders is not only ex post facto. It's not only coming up after the fact that somebody says, don't hold me responsible. It's also happening in real time. So here we have a picture of the deportation, one of the deportations from Dusseldorf to Riga. And these are the people that are being deported. And what we have from this particular deportation is both the real-time reports of the Nazi officer who was on the track and filling out these reports in real time, in other words, what he's writing. And we can contrast that with a testimony from a woman who was on that train and who survived. So this is the police officer who was there. And when he writes up his report about the boarding of the train, he writes as follows. Departure of the transport was planned for 9:30. The Jews were therefore brought to the loading ramp ready to board at 4 a.m. However, the Reichsbahn could not have the train ready so early, allegedly due to lack of personnel. Subsequently, the loading of the Jews did not begin until 9 a.m. Listen to, so far, you could be loading cows. In other words, there's nothing particularly in this report which indicates that it's people that are being loaded in order to be deported and murdered. The loading of the Jews was carried out in great haste as the Reichsbahn insisted that the train must depart on time. It is therefore no surprise that some of the carts were overloaded while others had only 35 to 40 passengers. This caused problems throughout the entire trip to Riga, since individual Jews repeatedly attempted to get into the less crowded cars. It's described as an irritation. And if you put yourself in the mind as of the person, the Nebuch Jew, who's in that very overcrowded train, and maybe his sister or his brother or his child is in the other car, and you picture the desperation with which they're trying to switch their cars, all of that has been drained out. This is an annoyance in his processing of the boarding of the train. Okay, so this is his report on the boarding of the train. And let's look what Hilda Sherman, who was one of those people being boarded, how she describes the boarding of the train. She says, the next morning at dawn, we were forced to the ramp. The train had not arrived. It was bitterly cold. We stood there from 4 a.m. until 9 a.m. Okay, so that's that delay, which to him was simply a delay and an annoyance. She's describing how freezing cold it is and what it was like to stand there for those 5 hours. We were then called and the trip began on the 11th of December, 1941. Everything had been taken from us. One of the people asked one of the guards, an SS man, when the train was coming. They took out a club and beat him for so long that he remained on the ground. He didn't get on the transport. That was our first dead. That was the beginning. That event didn't even make it into Salader's report. And I don't think it was because he was trying to hide anything. It was simply unimportant. What was important was the delay. The unimportant was the irritation with the unevenness of the load and other sorts of technicalities. The fact that there was a person who was beaten to death in front of everyone and lying there, that didn't even make it into his report. Another piece of Hilda's report, she describes what they were allowed to bring with them and that she was with her husband's family. And then she says, we arrived in Düsseldorf at dawn. I saw how the people of the town were watching. They did not go out on the street. They were watching from behind the windows. I saw how the curtains were moving. No one can claim that they did not see. Of course they saw us. We were over 1,000 people. Okay, so you're understanding that for her, and this goes back to the notion of bystanders, she sees people watching and how it's burning inside her. And she says, of course they saw us. We were over 1,000 people. And if we compare this to the Salader report of that precise time, he writes as follows: the Drew transport planned for December 11, 1941, same date she says, included 1,007 Jews. The transport was compiled of Jews of both sexes, of various ages, from babies to 65 years old. Drained of all human elements. The 1,007 is very, very specific, but any implication of what it means to walk down the street with 1,000 people, with people peeking out, all of that is unimportant. It's the preciseness of that 1,000. And then he writes as follows: on the way from the slaughterhouse yard to the platform, a male Jew attempted to commit suicide by throwing himself in front of the streetcar, but he was caught by the streetcar's bumper and only slightly injured. He recovered during the trip and realized that he could not avoid sharing the fate of the evacuees. Okay, so here he sees somebody attempting to commit suicide, but he's going to do his job properly. This person's going to be thrown onto the train as required. An elderly Jewish woman walked away from the platform without anyone noticing. It was raining and it was very dark. She entered a neighboring house, took off her clothes, and sat on a toilet. A cleaning woman noticed her, however, and she too was led back to the transport. Imagine you're that elderly woman. You see what's happening. You have the goal to sneak away and to try to pose and sit there on a toilet, hoping, praying that nobody noticed. You're sitting there naked on a toilet, an elderly person, and then there's a bang at the door and you get dragged out. It's a horror. It's literally a horror. And in his retelling of it, it's been drained of all of that. And so this is what I say: how does a man like Salader, who was normal before, I guess, and after the war, how does he deal with his role in all of this? He drains all of the human elements out of it. Interestingly, after the war, he was put on some kind of review. It wasn't exactly a trial, but as to his participation during the war. And he got kind of just a slap on the wrist. He was allowed to keep his pension, but he was not allowed to work as a partial pension, but he was not allowed to continue to work as a policeman, which frankly didn't matter at that point because he was much, much older. But he had, one would say, the gall or the gumption to appeal this sentence. And in fact, when he appealed it, he promised, he goes, I promise I will also serve the cause with my whole being. He says, just like I served the Third Reich, I'll now serve whatever rules are going to be here. In other words, he viewed himself, I'm a good policeman. I don't make the rules. I simply execute whatever the rules are that I'm told. And in the face of that appeal, he won. He got back his full pension, and theoretically he was allowed to return to the police force, although again, it was not practical at that point. From here, we can we see in full relief color the ways in which the perpetrators are able to live with themselves by kind of draining out the human content, in contrast to what we know really happened. The other method, I should say the next method which we discussed, was this idea of a split personality. The idea that somebody is not able anymore, somebody who's involved in murder, who's out there literally shooting people. They can't, how much can you drain the human content out of it if you're literally shooting and murdering people? You can't talk about timetables anymore. How do those people exist with this duality? Now, there's a Nazi soldier who was involved in the Einsatzgruppen, and we've mentioned the Einsatzgruppen before with Operation Barbarossa in 1941. These were the mobile killing units which invaded the Soviet Union, broke the prior pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, and they literally went from town to town, murdering communist Jews as they're there. Now, after the war, this guy, Kurt Kretschmer, was, again, there was some sort of investigation. And as part of this investigation, the letters which he wrote home in the summer of 1942, I think it's the summer, no, I'm sorry, October of 1942, some of those letters were entered into evidence. It's quite long, but there's something about it which makes me want to read every last word of it to you. So buckle up, it's a little bit long. I want you to hear the letter which a man who's involved literally in murdering people day in, day out. That's his work at this point of time. And this is the letter which he writes home. I'm going to read it to you now, okay? It's from Kursk, October 15th, 1942. Dear wife, dear children, you will be surprised to receive a letter from me mailed from the Reich. But the reason for this is that someone is going on leave and is taking the letter along and then mailing it. Reminds me of when we were here for the year and you would send mail letters back. In addition, I am giving the person on leave a parcel, 8 kilograms to take, which he is supposed to mail in Koblenz. It contains 5 kilograms of butter, 2.5 kilograms of wheat flour, and 1 bar of hard soap. I assume that you will have the parcel by October 22 to 24, 1942. Then if mom also gets curd cheese, she can make cheese pastries for Wurzel's birthday. I packed the parcel myself. In addition, another parcel is on the way to be mailed in Berlin. I have no idea how it was packed. I wasn't there long enough to see it. It is supposed to contain 3 kilograms of butter, 1 kilogram of flour, 1 kilogram of honey, and in addition from me, 2 bottles of honey, 1 bottle of vodka schnapps. Please write and let me know when it arrives. Enclosed are both parcels are inconsequential notes added by me. Yesterday, Wednesday, October 14, 1942, I received a letter dated October 5th, 1942, the 5th one received by me without a number, and the newspapers, number 14. Thank you very much for your dear letters. In the meantime, I hope that you will have also received more letters from me. Meanwhile, my nerves have calmed down again to some extent. Therefore, I don't know whether I might have done better not to write letter number 10. Well, it hasn't been said. Well, it has been sent. It is also better if mom is informed about everything. About my present life, I can tell you that to some degree, it is taking a regular course. We have a small house similar to those on Gartenstrasse, only not so nice, confiscated, meaning it was taken from a Jewish family. Everything is dirty and badly built. Approximately 40 families lived here before. They were forced to make room for us. I myself have a 2-room apartment now. The living area is my workroom with the war chest, and I sleep in the kitchen. The apartment gets its heat from the kitchen. Up to now, the weather has not been very cold, so it is bearable. We bring in wood in vast quantities. I hope it lasts through the winter. The prisoners have to chop it and stack it, so I can put up with life here. If only you were all here with me, it would be wonderful. 6 a.m. is wake-up time. I always awake earlier, however, because I haven't been able thus far to sleep for longer than 5 hours, even though I sometimes go to bed earlier. At 7 a.m., there is coffee, bread as much as you want, a dab of butter, around 60 grams, sometimes fruit puree or artificial honey. I'm starting to rethink in the time of the thing. I'm not going to read all of this, okay? I think you got the basic gist of it. He says, we don't get out of the building except for going to the movie. I'll send you the letter. Movies in the theater and invited. Sunday is just like the weekdays. Here, there's something else. Now, my best regards. Here, one second here. It is nice that Mr. Kern is supposed to go to France. I think he would be too soft for the East. Nevertheless, people change here. The sight of blood is something you get used to quite soon, but blood sausage is not popular with us here. Now, my best regards to you all. In the near future, my packages will reach you. For the time being, I can't send anything more as nothing is allowed to be sold, blah, blah, blah. For the children, many kisses and hugs. For dear mom, a long and heartfelt kiss. You are my everything. All right, again, I'm sorry that if I read too much, but to me, every last detail seems to turn in me the screws a little bit tighter in my anger. All of this obsession over the detail and how much food. And it also helps you understand a little bit of the complicity of people back home who are getting all these fantastic packages as rewards for the amazing work which their husbands are doing, sometimes their sons. And this is, again, one of the methods of people who are involved in the actual killing of what they do. And interestingly, there's a piece of artwork which was done by this Mark Zhinitsky, who was a survivor himself. And in it, he shows that these murderers up on top, you can see that there are these family men with the bouncing beautiful children, just like all of the German propaganda, these beautiful blonde children and a beautiful wife and everything is wonderful. And yet, if you look below the waist, you see a smoking gun, you see that he's lying on top of dead bodies. And so this is the way in which many of the victims saw their murderers. And this is in fact a way in which many of these murderers carried on. They had a normal life in one part, and they had this murderous nature below. I wanna get some other quotes of this sort of dehumanization, the way in which the murderers stopped seeing the people who they were killing as human beings at all. This is Franz Stangl. He had been involved in the T4 program. I believe I mentioned the T4 program to you, but that was the program where people who were mentally and physically disabled were killed, not necessarily Jews. Those were the first victims of the gas program in Germany. And when the German church, it was a secret program, when the German church, news of it leaked to the German church, there was pressure on the Nazis to stop this euthanasia program, killing these people in institutions. And at that point, the people who were involved, the staff there, was redirected to murder the Jews in the extermination camps, in the Reinhard camps, and he was reassigned to be the commandant of Treblinka. After the war, he moved to South America, and in the late 60s, he was brought back to Germany for trial. And while he was awaiting trial, a woman named Gita Sereni sat and had a number of very candid and horrific conversations with him, just for the way in which he was so incredibly open about his participation. And this is a series of snippets of that interview where he said, I'll read pieces of it to you. She asks him, would it be true to say that you were used to the liquidation? He thought for a moment. To tell you the truth, he said slowly and thoughtfully, one did become used to it. And then she asks him, in days, weeks, months? And then he says, months. It was months before I could look them in the eye. I repressed it all by trying to create a special place, gardens, new barracks, new kitchens, barbers, shoemakers, carpenters. In Treblinka, there was even a small zoo, all these things to help the people, handle the fact that they were doing this sort of work. And then he describes that he also started to drink at a certain point to avoid thinking about it. And then she asks him as follows. She says, would it be true to say that you felt they weren't really human beings? And then he answers, when I was on a trip once, years later in Brazil, my train stopped next to a slaughterhouse. The cattle in the pens, hearing the noise of the train, trotted up to the fence and stared at the train. They were very close to my window, one crowding the other, looking at me through that fence. And I thought then, look at this. This reminds me of Poland. That's just how the people look, trustingly, just before they went into the tins. And so then she asks him, so you didn't feel that you were human beings? And he answers, cargo. They were cargo. And then she asks him, there were so many children. Did they ever make you think of your children or how you would feel in the position of those parents? And then he answered, no, I can't say I ever thought that way. You see, I rarely saw them as individuals. It was always a huge mess. I sometimes stood on the wall and saw them in the tube. There was a path, which they called the tube, which led from the place where they were forced to disrobe into the gas chamber. And he saw them in the tube. But how can I explain it? They were naked, packed together, running, being driven with whips. Like in any case, here we have somebody who was literally face to face with the worst of the horror, a participant in the horror. And years later, he very candidly says he didn't see these as human beings. This is a way in which a person who in later years didn't become a sadistic murderer in South America. He was living a normative life and beforehand as well. And yet for those years, he was able to feel comfortable and psychologically unburden himself and feel okay with what he was doing. He said it took a little bit of time, but I got used to it. Yeah. There's not really much to hear because it's not, well, 1 second here. Sorry, I should have introduced this. With this form of the PowerPoint, it just launches right in. This is an example of somebody who was involved. He's a Lithuanian, and he was involved in these mass murders in Lithuania. And after many years, people come back and they're asking him to describe. And there are many interesting pieces. It's only about 2.5, 3 minutes, his testimony. There are many interesting pieces which you could tease out of these few words of what he says. But the one which I wanted to focus on is the way in which he disclaims responsibility. And you'll see to whom or to where he shifts responsibility for what he did. In other words, he did it. He knew it was wrong. He claims that he wasn't comfortable with it, but he doesn't feel that he can be personally held responsible for what happened. For those that can't see the subtitles, he's saying that the Jews came without any resistance. And he's describing how whole families were forced to lie down into a pit. And if you had to choose whether to choose the parent, to shoot the parent or the child first, he first decided to shoot the father, the parent, to save the parent the anguish of seeing the child being murdered. He didn't use a machine gun. They had to then shoot a second time when you shot the child. He's saying it was a terrible feeling to do all this. He didn't discuss after the war what he did. He said it was shameful and horrible. No, no. They're asking, how did you justify everything which is happening to the Jews? Yeah, I don't blame anyone else. I just blame God. One second. It feels to me a sense of responsibility, just like we did with Salader and with the woman who's on the train. And even though it'll take a minute or two, if we're going to describe how this man is, let's say we just heard his rendition. Oh, it was really terrible. The Jews went, they just laid down and he killed the father first. I'm sorry? Okay, so nobody had a gun to their head. In other words, forced is a very broad kind of question.
I think you said that when you're forced to do it.
Yeah, again, forced, Chaya is asking, were they forced? In other words, did someone take him out of his house, put a gun to his head and say, go do this? That didn't happen. That was not the MO of how these people were rounded up. They were either part of Lithuanian militias, and that whole militia was called to go do it. What's interesting is that not only with the Einsatz group and with all of these, there were almost never any significant kinds of repercussions if somebody said, I can't do this. Maybe they'd be forced to do one. There are some testimonies that say that, but by and large, most of the people volunteered to some degree or another. In other words, he may have felt forced because everybody else was doing it. He may have felt forced because someone said, come on along. What, you're going to be a sissy? But he wasn't forced in the sense that his life wasn't on the line if he didn't want to kill a Jew. No, people were not arrested and punished for not participating in these events. One moment, I want to show this next video. Let's just check that the volume is on. This is a testimony of a Jew who was pulled out and taken to one of these killing sites manned by Lithuanians. Let me see if it'll still get the sound.
לא היה לנו כבר כוח, וביקשנו כבר המוות שיבוא עלינו כמה שיותר מהר. ליטאי אחד קרא סמרטוט, והייתה לנו לקשור העיניים. אני קשרתי העיניים קצת יותר גבוה, שאני יכול לראות מה שיש מתחתיי, ושהם לא ירגישו את זה. הליטאים שירו בנו, ירו ליטאים, לא גרמנים. הם ירו מרובים רגילים.
That's what he said also. It wasn't a machine gun, regular shot.
אנחנו עמדנו בתוך התעלה כבר על הרוגים. ומאחורה נתנו פקודה לירות. בזמן שנתנו הפקודה לירות, סבי שמואל ליפשין, אבא של אמי, התחיל להגיד שמע ישראל. אני הספקתי רק פעם אחת, ואני אשמע ישראל, ונקב היה הירייה, נפלתי לפני הירייה, וההרוגים נפלו עליי. וככה שכבתי כל הזמן, לא בכיתי, הייתי כמובן. שכבתי, ירו וירו עוד. אחר כך, אחרי הרבה זמן, פחות ופחות התחילו לירות, ונהיה שקט, פחות או יותר. חשבתי שזה כבר לילה. התחלתי להסתובב ולצאת. כשהתחלתי להסתובב, תפסו אותי ברגל. התברר שמעליי שכב עוד אחת. גם היה לי, אני הייתי בן 16. היה עוד אחת ילד, גם לגילי בערך. הוא תפס אותי ברגל. התברר שגם הוא לא נפצע, וגם בסדר. עזרנו אחת לשני, ואיך שהוא יצאנו מתחת להרוגים.
If we read the letters which Carl Kretzmer is writing home, if we even see the snippet of that man, of the Lithuanian murderer and his rendition, you're missing the Shema Yisrael. You're missing the father and the grandfather. You're missing the boy who finds himself at 16 years old in a pit of dead and finds another friend, another boy his age, and together they try to escape. And for that reason, those other testimonies, those other letters are able to coexist because they've edited out all of that human drama, and or they've either viewed them as not humans, as Stangl did in Treblinka. They've gotten used to it to some degree or another. They focused on their own family back home, and they're not seeing what they're doing. It's just work. They're blaming God and just viewing themselves as a peon, kind of doing what they have to do. Whatever the reason is, that's how they're managing to survive and to exist. As I mentioned earlier, in the different ways in which people manage this sort of dichotomy, this sort of conflict, one of the ways also was that they ascribed themselves as adhering to some other set of values. In other words, they viewed murder, well, in general, murder is not a great thing to do, but I'm not violating moral codes because I have a different, higher set of moral codes. The murder of the Shoah was not a violation of morality, but rather there's a different sort of morality which I ascribe to. And that came from the very top. Himmler in 1943, when he went to speak to rile up the troops, he spoke as follows. This is a very famous speech, and I'll read a section of it to you. He says, I also want to speak to you here in complete frankness of a really grave chapter. Amongst ourselves, for once, it shall be said quite openly, but all the same, we will never speak about it in public. Okay, so we're doing this great thing, but we understand that the rest of the world is not quite ready to hear what it is that we're doing. This is one of the things that is said, easily said. The Jewish people are going to be exterminated. In other words, that's avada. That's an easy thing because that's such an obvious target. That's what every party member says. Sure, it's in our program, elimination of the Jews, extermination, it'll be done. And then they all come along, the 80 million worthy Germans, and each one has his one decent Jew. Of course, all the others are swine, but this one, he is a first-rate Jew. In other words, he's decrying the fact that people talk a good game, but then they find the exceptions for that one Jew who they think is really okay. And he's saying, if you're going to be truly moral, if you're going to truly stand by your principles, you should understand that all Jews have to be killed and that there shouldn't be any exceptions. He says, most of you men know what it's like to see 100 corpses side by side, or 500, or 1,000. To have stood fast through this, and except for cases of human weakness, to have stayed decent, that has made us hard. This is an unwritten and never to be written page of glory in our history. For we know how difficult it would be for us today under bombing raids and hardships and the deprivations of war, if we were to still have the Jews in every city as secret saboteurs, agitators, and inciters. In other words, thank God, because you have been able to stay hard and strong, chazak, in your principles. Therefore, Germany would be in much worse state if we couldn't rely on all of your good adherence to these important values. The wealth they possessed, we took from them. I gave a strict order, which has been carried out, that this wealth will, of course, be turned over to the Reich in its entirety. We have taken none of it for ourselves. Individuals who have erred will be punished in accordance with the order given by me at the start, threatening that anyone who takes as much as a single mark of this money is a dead man. A number of SS men, they are not very many, committed this offense, and they shall die. There will be no mercy. We had the moral right. We had the duty towards our people to destroy this people that wanted to destroy us, but we do not have the right to enrich ourselves by so much as a fur, a watch, by one mark, a cigarette, or anything else. In other words, we have our principles and we have to stand by our principles. The murder of the Jews is not a blip or an exception or a violation. Rather, the murder of the Jews is a heralded, fantastic thing, which we Nazis are doing. And in fact, going back to Franz Stangl, here you can see where he's being interviewed. She asks him, did you ever speak to any of the people, the Jews who arrived in the transport? And he says, I remember one occasion They were standing there just after they arrived, and one Jew came up to me and said he wanted to make a complaint. So I said, yes, certainly. What was it? He said that one of the Lithuanian guards had promised to give him water if he gave him his watch, but he had taken the watch and not given him any water. Well, that wasn't right, was it? Anyway, I didn't permit pilfering. I asked the Lithuanians then and there who it was that had taken the watch. I made them all line up and turn out their pockets. And then that Jew was sent to be murdered. And so there's this self-righteousness that he at least held by the proper etiquette, by the proper morals of not having any kind of theft go on. And for that, he feels that he can still look at himself in the mirror. This question of how was it humanly possible really came to be part of, I would say, almost popular literature in the Holocaust world in 1992. In 1992, Professor Christopher Browning published this book, Ordinary Men. And as part of that book, what he did was he analyzed the post-war interviews and interrogations of men who were in the blue police in Germany and who were sent and did among the most horrific, it wasn't exactly the Einsatzgruppen, but who went and murdered whole towns, taking the people out of their homes, marching them to the forest, doing cleanup and sending people onto trains and murdering everybody who didn't go. So here we have these, what happened is that the able-bodied younger people were all off fighting in the war. So now they have to call in the Miluimnikim. So these people are middle-aged, these police officers. They developed presumably their moral compass before 1933, and they were drafted. So these are not volunteers. You don't have this selection bias where everybody who's jumping into the police force already hates Jews. People are being pulled out of their normal life, and they're being told, now you have to go serve, and they're not standing, somewhere passively on the side. They're literally engaging in murder. And in his review of these interrogations, he came to the conclusion that while there was some ideology, for the most part, it was group social psychology principles which were pushing people to commit these murders. And he said that he felt that to the extent people hated Jews, oftentimes it was after the fact. In other words, they were pulled in to commit murder, and then afterwards they rationalized it by cleaving on and adhering to various Nazi ideology. But for the most part, most people, when placed in these positions, they tend to defer to authority, and that they were being pulled along, and there was a new norm being created. And that when they were standing there, and he particularly points out that there were many opportunities for people to decline to participate in the most horrific parts of the murder, and there were some who did. And yet they always had oversubscription. In other words, if they said tomorrow we have to go, who wants to come? Plenty of people wanted to come. And again, he rested his analysis of these interviews, put it on this idea that this was kind of part of social psychology and the way people are built. This unleashed a fury of sorts. And a few years later, again, I think they were all treated fairly decently, and that couldn't, at least in his reading of these reports, that wouldn't account for the difference. There was no real punishment, whether it was withholding food or sending you home or anything else, by not participating. That was his reading of these documents. And it didn't take long for there to be a rebuttal of sorts in the form of this book by Professor Daniel Goldhagen. And Goldhagen felt, and he tapped on a feeling which others felt, that there was something about the reliance on social psychology, which he felt a little bit let the perpetrators off the hook. Now, I'll say that then in later publications of Christopher Browning's book, he writes a rebuttal to Goldhagen. So it goes back and forth, but Goldhagen highlighted other aspects. First of all, he highlighted the fact that a lot of the persecution and the murder of the Jews was accompanied by a lot of gratuitous violence. In other words, it wasn't only that they had to go kill. In the T4 program, when they were gassing in the euthanasia program, there wasn't a parallel track of violence towards disabled people. This was a job and people did their job. By contrast, if you look at this picture here, you can see here are, these are just regular soldiers that are coming through when there's the invasion of Poland. And nobody ever told these guys to go and cut somebody's beard or to hit on all of these highly symbolic Jewish kinds of bits of violence. And yet it was replete, it was everywhere, it was a consistent feature of the invasion. And all sorts of other gratuitous violence, in other words, after there would be a roundup of the Jews from a certain town, then afterwards, the Nazis would set out on what they would call Judenjagd, which is a hunt where they would go into the forest to get the last few that might have be hiding somewhere, these Jew hunts, which they would participate in, which again, they participated in with great zeal. And oftentimes it was physically punishing. It was difficult work. They had to go climbing through forests. And yet there was a great deal of participation and excitement and enthusiasm for these. So what he's pointing at, he said the crux of his argument is that it's not appropriate to say anybody can do it. There was something very specific about German anti-Semitism, which made this highly possible. Yes.
In Browning's book, is he almost excusing them?
No, so that's the thing. In his rebuttal afterwards, he explains that by no means is he excusing them, and he was explaining one of the features, and he doesn't deny the fact that there were many who actually hated Jews horribly and were participating in this murder because they hated Jews. But what he was trying to highlight, at least in his book, is that there were many, that the deference to authority was part and parcel of the murder as well. And that was the way in which people who were, again, otherwise normative, got pulled into committing acts of horrible violence. And another point that Goldhagen makes is that in other genocides historically, which are studies, there never seems to be this push to try to drain the ideology or the nationality out of what happened and to kind of see it as this human element. And he was critical of the fact that somehow when it comes to the Holocaust, people kind of discuss it on this more lofty plane. And he said, taking the word German out of it, taking German ideology out of it, makes the whole discussion, makes the whole discourse meaningless. You have to understand this in the way, with the particular actors at that time and in that place. And again, afterwards, there were many papers written since 1996 trying to reconcile the two ideas. And the truth of the matter is that there's a lot which is similar. In other words, both of them discuss the fact that participation was incredibly widespread. In other words, that much of the German nation was a part of this and that ideology was a part of it, but it's a question more of emphasis.
Kind of like the way Poland said years ago, the Poles weren't to blame, don't blame the Poles. It just
Exactly.
happened.
Yes,
Like that's
yes.
what
And one second, how much time do I have? No, I'm going to keep going. Sorry. I just wanted to add one other thing, which is that, well, no, I'll go past this 1 second here. No time for that. Well, I like it. What I was just going to say is that when I read Goldhagen's book, it reminds me of a Dvar Torah I learned as a kid for the Leil HaSeder, where they discuss the issue of the plague of frogs. And it says in the Torah that there was Vayal HaTzfardeh, Vatal HaTzfardeh, there was one frog that came up, and yet then afterwards all of Egypt is filled with frogs. And the way that I remember learning it as a kid is that there was this one chief frog and he whistled and all the other frogs came up because they were all kind of, frogs in waiting. And that this can be compared to this idea that there are anti-Semites who are kind of latent. And then all you need is one guy to whistle and they all jump up. And to me, that was, I just couldn't help thinking about the frogs when I was reading Goldhagen's book about this idea that the German nation was kind of primed and laying in wait and ready for a leader like Hitler and the others of the top echelon in Nazi society. The truth is, you can't discuss this whole topic without also discussing the Eichmann trial. The Eichmann trial, as I imagine many of you know, was held in the early 60s here in Israel. Eichmann was one of the chief architects of the final solution. And this woman, Hannah Arendt, was a German Jew who had escaped Germany. She was, by the time the early 60s came around, a well-established, very, very prominent thinker, professor in the United States. And she was sent by the New Yorker to cover the trial in Jerusalem. And she was sending back reports which were being read in the United States. And the sum total of her reports afterwards were later published in this book form. And she coined this term, the banality of evil. What her reports focused on were the fact that she was unimpressed that Eichmann was actually, she thought he was of medium intelligence. She thought that he was really just an everyday man, a regular person. And she was struck by the fact that a very usual person can find themselves through ambition, interoffice politics, the like, can find themselves suddenly at the top of a pinnacle and creating the final solution. She said other things in her reports which were very critical of the Judenrat. And the truth is that for many years, this idea of the banality of evil was steadily taken apart and attacked. And she kind of stepped away from it in her writings in later years as well. The truth is that a lot of what she said may be inappropriate and may be somewhat synergistic with what Browning says. The problem with her analysis is that it doesn't really fit for Eichmann. In other words, what you might say for the everyday Joe police officer who was sitting at home and found themselves in a position of murder, and there could be some rationale to have that conversation, it's totally inappropriate when placed on top of someone like Eichmann. Because Eichmann was a stark anti-Semite even before the World War II began. He had to fight to climb up the ladder and to get to his position of power. In his position of power, he was not only sitting in offices, but also went out into the field and saw the gruesome murder which he was planning. In other words, he was exposed to the full array, not like those railway workers who could sequester themselves and look down at their desk. He was in the field and saw everything from beginning to end. And also because he was in a continual position as they invaded country after country to convince local authorities, local governments to cooperate with the final solution. And in various places in Slovakia, there was pushback where the local governments didn't necessarily want to give their cooperation. And he was fighting. So he was aware of the moral pushback against the final solution, and he was arguing for it. So to contend that he was somehow, sitting there and there was this banality about it is inappropriate. Again, that's what most people feel, inappropriate to saddle on Eichmann himself. And yet, at that time, there was also a poem written about him, about Eichmann, and it reads as follows. It says, all there is to know about Adolf Eichmann: eyes, medium; hair, medium; weight, medium; height, medium; distinguishing features, none; numbers of fingers, 10; numbers of toes, 10; intelligence, medium. What did you expect? Talons, oversized incisors, green saliva, madness. In other words, yes, the same Leonard Cohen. The overwhelming impression is that we want him to look somehow different, to have a mark of Cain, to look ugly, to something which would be reflective of the evil which he unleashed on the world. And yet when you look at him, he looks very normal. And we made it in time. I'd like to close with one, in my mind, powerful piece. If you'll recall at the beginning 2 weeks ago, when we started the lesson on letters, I brought you the testimony of of Yechiel Dinur, of Katzetnik. And at the time, Katzetnik was at the Eichmann trial, and he was going through in his description of how inappropriate it is to think that Auschwitz is part of this world. He described it as a planet. And he said, there we dressed differently, and there we spoke, the language meant different things, and family meant different things, and time traveled differently, and everything was different. And now, one second. He continues with this soliloquy, almost uninterrupted, for about 8 minutes, okay? And I'm skipping it, and I'm going to take you to about here, and you'll hopefully hear. Is the thing, someone check? Yeah, okay. Okay, so he's been going on for 8 minutes uninterrupted, and his lawyer now wants to try to direct him because he sees that something's going on here and he needs to be directed. So Hausner interrupts him here. And he's unable to stop. And now the judge interjects. And then he collapses. And afterwards, when he was asked, what happened? You were speaking. Why is it that you collapsed? He said as follows. He said, I was afraid about myself. I saw that I am capable to do this. I am exactly like he. It was that all of this prepared soliloquy and discussion of how far away Auschwitz was, how unreal Auschwitz was on some level his way to cope. And as he was speaking, and as kind of he was absorbing the fact that the person who was one of the main people responsible for all of this horror was simply a human being, just like him, sitting in that glass cage, that he couldn't handle anymore. And that caused his system simply to break apart and to totally disassemble. And perhaps that's how we can come back to the question of how is it humanly possible? It is humanly possible. As Rav Lau said, it's built into us. And as all these different methods show, it is possible for people to do these things. And that's perhaps as frightening as everything that actually happened. The fact that these are human beings. And that's heavy food for thought. Okay. And we finished at 10:58, mind you.
תודה רבה.
Oh, hi. I have a book for you.
Just like that.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
So what I wanted to so we go to the principal with it, but I don't know.
She didn't take money because we would obviously have to figure out
Told me I was
a
to get her
hasa'ah
there.
to get her there.
Will she go in a
She won't go in a regular taxi, but she said before this event, she had a bad trip. She had an obnoxious taxi driver who pulled out and fell with her. She never had to get her home. So that driver that we had to Debbie was very lovely. And again, I think.
Excuse me, it's still recording.
Well, you know,